political choice. At the expense of everyone else. The UK government is shrinking their responsibility to invest in and grow and rebalance the economy so that it does work for everyone, not just the wealthy few. The quantitative easing programme has seen the Bank of England write a cheque for £435 billion in support of the financial institutions. There's the magic money tree. That is £435 billion that has been added to our national debt, pushing up asset prices for those fortunate enough to benefit, while costing the rest of us dearly. So, while ordinary folk suffer, the wealthy have become richer. Conference, we have in effect rewarded the same institutions that created the financial crisis, where the rest of society yet again pays the price. That's fairness from a Tory government. And right now, across the United Kingdom, millions of people are suffering from a Tory pay cut, with wages lower in real terms than they were in 2007, after the slowest decade of wage growth in over 200 years. And the Tories have the audacity to call it a country working for everyone. Under the Tories, the UK's record in earnings has been much worse than almost every other developed economy, and with the increased cost of living, many people are now going from payday to payday, barely covering the basics, with little to show or put aside at the end of the month. Worse still, draconian Tory welfare cuts are driving those on low incomes into poverty, debt and destitution, forcing families to rely on food banks and emergency aid just to get by. It is absolutely shameful. And today, thanks to this Tory government, young people across the United Kingdom face being the first generation in modern times to be worse off than their parents, with lower lifetime earnings, higher rents and huge barriers to getting onto the housing ladder. Conference, social mobility should be the very cornerstone of our society, and it is something that I feel passionately about. My formative years were spent in Muirhouse, a housing scheme in Edinburgh. I, like many people at that time, didn't go to university. I went straight into work from school, starting out as a bank clerk. And with the opportunity to learn on the job, to prove my ability and to work my way up, I was able to succeed in business like others in my generation. Conference, I want everyone to have these same opportunities. But too often now, thanks to the right-wing policies of this Tory government, the support and chances that people need to get on are being restricted, are cut off entirely. That is a disgrace. So while Tory MPs back policies that make families and young people poorer, and while Labour MPs abstain on austerity and welfare cuts, it is the SNP that are holding the Tory government to account. And it's the SNP that are driving forward the case for a progressive alternative. Fairer alternatives like the bill being brought forward by Glasgow South MP Stuart MacDonald to end the scandal of exploitative unpaid trial shifts when people are looking for work. So here's a test for Theresa May. Stuart MacDonald's private member's bill can make a big difference. It tackles a scandal that disproportionately affects our young people just starting out and those looking to get back into work for unemployment or having just had a child. And when you're desperate for a job and trying to get off benefits, if you get them at all, then any trial shift seems better than no trial shift. But no one should be deprived of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. If you do the job, you should be paid for it. So to Theresa May and to Jeremy Corbyn, I say this. We can make a real difference in the lives of those looking for work. We can make life fairer for our young people, and we can end the rip-off practice of businesses who take prospective employees for granted. So join with us and back this bill. Let's end this injustice. Conference, Stuart's bill is just one example of where our SNP MPs are working hard to make a real difference. Chris Stevens is working tirelessly to improve workers' rights and challenge the Tory government's anti-trade union laws. Mary Black's campaign for justice for the thousands of WASPI women affected by the UK government's unfair pension changes has also shown that fairer choices could be made. The UK government has to recognise they have to deliver fairness to the WASPI women. We know that a win is now in sight. 8 DUP and 2 Tory MPs have signed a parliamentary motion showing their support, meaning that parliamentary arithmetic is now on our side to push the government to give women the pensions which are rightfully theirs. So, conference today, I am calling on Labour to join with us. Let's challenge the Tories, let's end this injustice, and let's deliver pensions fairness for the 1950s women. This afternoon in Parliament, it is the Scottish National Party that will be holding the government to account on another important issue, the disaster of universal credit. Neil Gray, leading on DWP questions in the Chamber, will be calling on the urgent halt of the universal credit rollout, the shambles which has made so many people destitute. In conference, one of my first acts as an MP in 2015 was to lead the opposition to the shameful Tory cuts to tax credits. It was the SNP that led the way in stopping the cuts to tax credits, showing the SNP can make a difference in Westminster. It is the SNP leading the way in fighting the Tory government's cuts to child tax credits. The two-child tax policy is deeply flawed, and my colleague Alison Thewlis has been working tirelessly on her campaign against the UK government's callous rate clause, which has been condemned by many organisations, including the British Medical Association. Conference, women should not have to disclose rape to avoid a financial penalty. The SNP will continue to campaign against this horrid policy, and I call on Philip Hammond to U-turn and scrap the two-child policy in his next budget. As we approach the budget next month, it is the SNP that will continue to argue for an end to austerity that is damaging our public services, cutting family support and holding back our economy. Instead, we'll call for a meaningful fiscal stimulus to boost growth and mitigate the impact of leaving the EU. We'll demand an end to the scandal of a Tory government that is charging VAT to Scotland's police and fire services and taking millions of pounds away from the front line. And in doing so, we don't want just to see a scrapping of the VAT. We want the repayment of the funds that we have paid over the course of the last few years. In conference, with the Brexit gun fired and the countdown to March 2019 rapidly underway, this budget must, above all, be a Brexit budget, a budget built and delivered on the vital premise that we're staying in the single market and the customs union. Because we know that even the threat of an extreme Tory Brexit is already damaging the country, driving up costs, scaring off investment and jobs, and squeezing living standards even further. And that's before the UK has left the EU. Because, let's be clear, leaving the world's largest single market and customs union would cost Scotland dearly, with the potential to lose 80,000 jobs, a cost to the economy of £11.2 billion a year, with cuts to family incomes across the country. There can be no cliff edge for the people of Scotland. Our business community and our key industries are warning week in, week out of the huge damage that will be done. Even Ruth Davidson admits that Brexit could deliver an economic hit that the UK may never recover from. But while Ruth Davidson, David Mundell and the Scottish Tories sit on their hands and obey Theresa May's every demand on Brexit, regardless of the impact in Scotland, and while there is barely a fag paper between Labour and the Tories' extreme Brexit plans under Jeremy Corbyn, SNP MPs will continue to fight tooth and nail to protect Scotland's national interests. Led by Stephen Gittins, our shadow Brexit team are holding the UK government to account, standing up for our vital place in the single market and customs union, pressing for a guarantee on the rights of the 3 million EU nationals living and working here, and opposing Tory plans to use the EU withdrawal bill to cover for a power grab from the Scottish Parliament. SNP MPs will always stand up for Scotland, for our NHS, our universities, our food and drink sector, and many other industries and communities that stand to lose out if the Tory Brexiteers get their way. Of course, conference, as the damage to Brexit becomes clearer, and as right-wing Tory policies continue to make families from Scotland worse off, we know that independence remains the only way to truly shape our future. But for as long as we remain tied to Westminster, you can be rest assured that our SNP MPs will continue to provide the strong voice that Scotland needs. Conference, thank you very much.
That was a fantastic start to conference, Ian. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to announce that to follow Ian is Jean Freeman, MSP.
Conference, as the Tories continue their internal fights, caring not a jot about the harm they do to our children, our families, to young and old, and as Labour, as always, puts itself first and last, here in Scotland, the SNP government drives forward real progress, protecting people from the worst effects of the Tories, delivering our promises, taking concrete action, and offering a positive, tangible vision of the country we can be. We call it the day job. And at the very heart of all we do is our fundamental, unshakable belief in equality. Economic and social progress and equality, two sides of the same coin. So while the Tories try to take powers away from our Parliament, I want to highlight just two areas where we are bringing progressive values to bear in delivering real, innovative change with the powers that we have. In social security, we are resetting its foundation, a rights-based system invested in by all of us and for all of us, because not one of us know if the day will come when we too will need that support. A system that will exemplify every day the principles of dignity, fairness and respect. No more treating people as scroungers and chancers. No more private sector delivered so-called health assessments. A system built on the experience and the ideas of 2,400 volunteers in our experience panels, a first for any government, on the expertise of the third sector organisations that work so hard for those they represent, and on the thinking and ideas and experience of experts. A new public service for Scotland that in the next 3.5 years will deliver our manifesto promises: an increase in carers allowance, lifelong disability awards, improvements in funeral support, extending winter fuel support for families with severely disabled children, and our new Best Start grant, more than doubling the financial support for the first child and bringing back support for the second and all subsequent children. A new public service for Scotland that does what a public service should do: serve the people of Scotland. How much more could we do if we had all the powers over social security? We would not be cutting support for families and children in the shambles that is universal credit. We would not be cutting support for disabled people. The Tories are. You know, we were there in the UK delegation to the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which met recently. There, but of course, not allowed to speak. That would upset the Foreign Office. And in a way, I don't blame them. The contrast between the UK's cruel and uncaring treatment of disabled people and our approach is one they can never justify. Last year, the UN Committee made clear that the Tories had carried out grave and systematic violations of the rights of people with disabilities. This final report, following their 2-year investigation, is the worst report a developed nation could possibly have had. A damning indictment on the persistent and systemic cruelty inflicted by the Tories on our fellow citizens. The only positive comments made were about the work of the SNP Scottish Government, directly involving disabled people in the development of our policies, with our disability delivery plan, our social security system, and our adoption of the accessible travel framework, all singled out for praise. In one report, the result of a 2-year inquiry, the stark contrast between two governments and how they view the people they serve. The UK government condemned by the UN, the Scottish government praised. Condemned by the UN, by faith groups, third sector organisations, local authorities, housing associations. Will this make the Tories think again? You'd have to hope so. But for a government to do that, it has to have compassion. It has to care more about the people it serves than it does about itself. So in truth, a Hamer Doots. But that report will make us look at what more we can do. The UN recognition is very welcome, but we are not complacent, and we will settle for nothing less than the transformational change in the opportunities, inclusion, and lives of disabled people in Scotland. That is what we do because that is the right thing to do. But we can only act where we have the powers to do so. We cannot fix every failure of the Tory UK government. Cuts to support for families and children, cuts to support for those suffering ill health or who are disabled, cuts to those looking for work and needing help to do that, the rape clause, the benefit cap, sanctioning families and forcing them into food banks, deliberately building a system where those on the lowest incomes are left without financial support for 6 weeks. Cuts for the disabled, the bedroom tax, and women in their 60s betrayed and left without a pension. A system, the foundations laid by Labour, colluded with by the Lib Dems, and now taken to extremes by a Tory government, furrowed to a failed dogma of austerity, where our social security system, that essential safety net for us all, is seen as nothing more than a cash cow. That is theft from each and every one of us to protect those with the most on the backs of those with the least. Now, when Theresa May became Prime Minister, she said that her leadership would mean fighting against the burning injustice that if you're born poor, you will die on average 9 years earlier than others. Now, Theresa has not had much luck with her advisors, so I want to help her out. If you want to fight burning injustice, Theresa, here are 5 things you could do right here, right now. Stop the rollout to universal credit, end the 6-week wait for the first payment, and fix the problems you've known about since 2013. Stop the work capability assessment that sees people deemed fit for work when they are clearly so ill they cannot work or need tailored support to get into work. Stop sanctioning people's benefits, removing financial support and forcing more and more to rely on food banks and emergency payments just to eat or keep a roof over their head. Act now to address a glaring wrong and provide a decent transitional arrangement for WASPy women and remove the rape clause. How could you even let that happen? You have been in government for 7 years and you didn't speak out. You want to tackle burning injustice? What bigger totem of injustice could there be than a system that dictates that if you're a woman on low income who has been raped, you need to fill in a form to get the financial support your child is entitled to? So, Theresa, I could give you 50 more. But if you have compassion, any sense of integrity, any principles that put those you serve above your own ambition, start now with these. Compare all of this to the SNP's actions to build a fairer and more equal Scotland. Where we can act, we do. Over £100 million a year, year on year, spent to protect people in Scotland from the iniquitous bedroom tax and provide crisis payments to those suffering most from a flawed benefit system. We lead the UK in promoting and, where we can, delivering the living wage. We have a higher level of employment, record health funding, no prescription charges, free personal care now to be extended to under 65s, free university tuition and childcare, an end to the right to buy, and delivery of nearly 70,000 homes. A child poverty bill that sets targets to reduce the number of children experiencing the damaging effects of poverty by 2020. We are supporting unemployed people, including disabled unemployed people, to find work and to stay in work through our new employment support services. And we don't need the threat of sanctions to make those services work. And we're tackling rough sleeping and transforming temporary accommodation through new action that will make a difference to people's lives, and backed by £50 million. All of that and more with limited powers and against a backdrop of a cut in our own budget that by 2020 will be over 9%. Our decade of achieving for the people of Scotland is making Scotland a better place to grow up in, to work in and to live, improving lives every day. This is a government that works for the people of Scotland, with energy, compassion and vision. Vision of how much more we could do. Powers for the common good and exercised with principle. A government for the people of Scotland, for whom our ambition is limitless. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. And next up, conference, I'm delighted to announce Philippa Whitford MP.
Well, good morning, conference. It's lovely to see so many faces filling up the stalls now. As health spokesperson at Westminster, obviously I actually spent most of my life in exile, down the road, facing Jeremy Hunt and trying to deal with the issues that I see in NHS England. That's where I really see the contrast in approach. While we still have a public, unified health service, in England, they're still outsourcing and privatising. This is going to be accelerated by the reorganisation they're planning. In 2010, they said no reorganisation. What happened? Health and Social Care Act. In 2015, they said no reorganisation. What are they doing now? Totally reorganising the shape of NHS England, and not just outsourcing services to private companies. Having squandered so much money in doing that in the first place, they're actually going to pay them more millions to try and join it back up again. What a waste of money. The healthcare market in England costs between 5 and 10 billion, 5 and 10 billion pounds. Just in the administration, the bidding, the tendering, the corporate lawyers, the company profits. All of this is taking money out of frontline healthcare. So what we see down in England is we see rationing of treatment. Older citizens are being denied hip or knee replacements until they can hardly walk. And if you've got a cataract, tough. You're not going to get that done until you can only see the top 3 letters on the chart. That means you're no longer driving. If you're being stuck in your house, if you're losing contact with friends and becoming isolated, you have a greater chance of your mental state deteriorating. Loneliness is one of the biggest killers. It doesn't make sense. Our Cabinet Secretary takes a totally different approach. We're investing in expanding elective services so that we can keep up with what are known as hips, knees, and eyes. Because if you can see, and you can walk, and you can take your bus pass and get down the town to meet your cronies, believe me, you'll stay a lot more active and a lot more healthy. Of course, in England, if you're wealthy, you can pay to have your cataract done, because in England, they'll only fix one. They won't fix the second. But unfortunately, it'll cost you £850, and that's to the NHS. So this idea that the NHS is free at the point of use in England is long gone. I don't just believe in independence for Scotland. I believe in independence for our older citizens as well. When it comes to dealing with staff, what did we see in England? We saw Jeremy Hunt's attack on junior doctors that led to a strike. Junior doctors out on the streets, something that had not happened for over 40 years. What's wrong with the man? We see that they want to keep the pay cap, despite all the speeches over the summer praising emergency services and NHS staff. Our Cabinet Secretary is working to lift that cap. What we see in England is 20,000 nurse redundancies. We haven't had any compulsory redundancies in Scotland, despite the crash in 2008. Now, we face our challenges. There's no question about that. I would say our biggest challenge is staff. Our biggest challenge is workforce. But what's going to happen? Brexit. That's going to make that a hell of a lot worse if we lose our EU colleagues and if we don't attract EU colleagues in the future. Many of you know that EU nationals are not ahead of you in the queue for the NHS. They're probably the doctor or nurse that you're actually going to see when you get there. We've seen a 95% drop in the number of EU nurses who are registering to come and work in the UK. That is an unmitigated disaster that will affect every single health service right across the United Kingdom. We want them, and we absolutely want them in Scotland. Now, our other big challenge is increased demand. Now, it's a problem dealing with increased demand when you've got workforce challenges. But that increased demand is because, I hate to tell you if you haven't worked it out, we're all getting older. And the big problem is we're not actually aging well. This is something we need to learn to do, is to age well. We talk quite a lot about trying to improve our health, and I'm proud of the health moves that the Scottish Government have taken. I'm even proud of Jack McConnell and the smoking ban. That was the first step. We were the first country in the United Kingdom to bring that in, and that has improved heart health. But our SNP Scottish Government has been trying to take that forward. We've been trying to bring in minimum unit pricing to tackle alcohol for 5 years, and yet we're still stuck and haven't managed to do it. We're bringing in an imaginative childhood obesity strategy. We're rolling out the Daily Mile. In the recent programme for government, the funding for active transport was doubled. So all of us, and that absolutely includes me, need to get on our bikes. Not to get a job, as some Tories would suggest, but actually to get fit. So I hope all of you are cycling back home. We all know that health does not come from the NHS. The NHS is about treating illness or managing illness. Health comes from the things that Gina's been talking about. It comes from children having a decent start in life. That's why we're giving them a baby box full of the essentials that every single child in Scotland needs, and now every single child in Scotland will get. That's why we're trying to expand free childcare. That's why we are tackling the unfairness of the social security system and providing dignity for disabled and their carers. But the problem is, we don't control all the powers, as Jean said. We can't develop a fair tax and social security system because we've only been given 14% of social security and 29% of tax. People need to wake up and realize poverty is the biggest driver of ill health, and the biggest driver of poverty is the relentless austerity of this Tory government. If we want to have a healthier Scotland, and I mean a truly healthy Scotland, we need to be able to put health and well-being, so physical health and mental well-being, at the core of every political decision, from your local council to Holyrood. But we don't have all the powers to do that. So at some point, the people of Scotland will need to face a choice. Either you get into the backseat of Theresa's car, fold your arms, put your finger on your lips and say, "No worries about us, we'll just sit here quietly while you become more isolationist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-vulnerable." Or we need to climb into the driving seat so that we can take Scotland forward to be the country we want it to be. Thank you.
Thank you, conference. Could we have one last show of appreciation for Ian Blackford, Jean Freeman and Philippa Whitford, showing us how the SNP is standing up for Scotland. Thank you, conference. And I should say the reason why Ian left the stage is that he was actually going to catch a flight off back down to Westminster to go and carry on with his job of standing up for Scotland down there. We'll move on, conference, to resolutions. And our first resolution this afternoon is resolution number 4 on ending public sector pay restraint. And could I call Jeff Errol to move, please, to be followed by Craig Lundy to second.
Good morning, Conference. Jeff Earl, Portobello and Craig Miller Branch proposing Resolution 4 on public sector pay restraint. Colleagues, I'm a community nurse and I'm proud to say that I'm a public sector worker. Proud that my life is spent not only doing a job that I love, but doing it for the benefit of society and my fellow citizens. I'm proud of the way my public sector colleagues work to provide first-class services to the community, and this despite the appalling cuts that Westminster is forcing on us. Cuts forced on Scotland and the rest of the UK by its failed austerity programme, a programme that penalises the weakest in society, a programme of austerity that attacks public sector workers who commit themselves to the service of its fellow citizens, a programme of austerity designed to cut the funding of those services that are trying to minimise the impact of failed Westminster policies. Let's be clear, delegates, the current economic difficulties were caused by a banking collapse. Was it the firefighters who caused the banking collapse? Was it teachers or the ambulance service? Was it police officers, healthcare workers? Was it the public sector workers that caused the banking collapse? No. It was the greed of the financial market and the deregulation first introduced by Thatcher and the Conservative Party and carried on by the Labour Party under the leadership of Blair and Brown. Yet who paid... Thank you. Yet who pays for this failure? Not those that caused the crash, oh no. It's the public sector workers and the weakest in society that are deemed that they must pay for this. This, colleagues, is wrong. My wages have fallen by 15% since 2010. Some of my colleagues by 20%. That's a fifth of their income gone. And I'll repeat that. That's a fifth of their income has gone. And these are some of the lowest paid workers in society. But in Scotland, we can choose a different direction. The Scottish Government and SNP government was the first government across the UK to say that it will be ending the pay cap on public sector pay. That means a lot to public sector workers because it means we're appreciated. I would also like to take this moment to actually thank the SNP group down at Westminster, because this is not just public sector workers in Scotland, it's about public sector workers across the UK, because it is Westminster that controls the public purse. We have to work in a financial envelope that they dictate to us, and that affects public sector pay for everybody. At a recent rally organised by the Royal College of Nursing, my union, the only leader of a party to lead his MPs out of the Palace of Westminster to support healthcare workers, to stand shoulder to shoulder with nurses, was Ian Blackford and his SNP group. Inside Westminster, there was a meeting to discuss health sector pays. Scottish MPs. Only the SNP bothered to show up. No Scottish Conservatives, no Scottish Lib Dems, and to their utter shame, not one single Scottish Labour MP came to support the workers. In Scotland, the SNP and the Scottish Government stands with public sector workers. We believe in a community, not self-interest. We believe in public service, not personal greed. The recently announced programme for government that was announced by Nicola Sturgeon is the most progressive manifesto by any government in the 4 countries. But let's not fool ourselves. It may well be that we need to look at a new progressive tax regime. But if we value our public sector workers, this surely is a price worth paying. At the recent Tory party conference, Theresa May received a standing ovation for saying, pay respect to healthcare workers. Well, I say to her, respect healthcare workers' pay. Westminster must follow the lead of the Scottish Government. It must scrap the cap, and that means not just the 1% cap, but no more below inflation pay awards. Conference, please support this resolution and support public sector workers. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jeff was a first-time speaker, Conference. Craig Lundy to second, and could Councillor Michelle Campbell be ready to speak for the resolution?
Craig Lundy, SNP Trade Union Group, seconding motion 4. Conference, delegates, today my own trade union PCS, representing the vast majority of civil servants in our country and many other workers in both private and public sectors, has launched a non-statutory consultative ballot asking its public sector members 2 questions. Let me put you in their place and see if you can help them decide. Do you agree that the pay cap should be scrapped and that funds should be made available to provide you with an above-inflation pay rise? Yes is the answer to that. And if the government refused to scrap the pay cap, are you prepared to take part in industrial action? Yes. So we want two answers to that, yes and yes. Now, colleagues, these are crucial questions, not only for my colleagues in PCS, but for every one of us in the independence movement in general, and in our party in particular. After over 40 years of neoliberalism, the protections provided by collective bargaining agreements have been deliberately eroded and in many sectors utterly destroyed. The rights of workers and working class people more generally to combine in trade unions and community organisations to make their feelings and ultimately their collective strength known to their employers, politicians and civil society in general has been under constant attack throughout this entire period. As the party who will lead Scotland into independence, we need to be prepared to consider how we will turn this epoch around and live up to our social democratic aspirations. Yesterday afternoon, it pains me to say that I was treated to the unedifying spectacle of seniors party members playing the old no true independence supporter game with each other. A sorry sight, given the historic gains that we've made. But people don't join the SNP to spend time swithering over whether independence might be a good idea. The clue is in the party membership card, and we should take that in good faith. Moving swiftly on to the real questions. What kind of independent Scotland do we want, and how are we going to get it? And in the meantime, we have to ask, how do we do devolved government in a manner that gives notice of the kind of future Scotland we want? I want to stress today in particular that we must go forward with a credible position on workers' rights, terms and conditions, in particular pay, that gives working class people the power to shape their own destiny and to keep their inevitable exploitation to a minimum. After all, it is these working class people who will build a new Scotland, and we must empower them to do so wherever possible right now. We have to be able to guarantee our public sector workers' living standards that keep up with inflationary trends in our economy. So we've got to commit to award a pay rise that exceeds the rate of inflation. Anything less after 10 years of falling standards of living is simply to say that we are slightly less ruthless neoliberals than the British Tory party. Talk about damning ourselves with faint praise. Please support the resolution.
Councillor Michelle Campbell, and to be followed by Ross Cassie to support the resolution. And can I ask all speakers to try and stick to time, please? We do have a lot to get through this morning. 5 minutes for moving a resolution and 3 minutes for everyone else.
Oh, good morning, Conference. A bit easier to speak on this one today. I have worked for the NHS for the best part of 10 years. I joined as a nurse just before the recession hit. So I'm one of those nurses that they tried to sell a recession as where you're still getting your increments. I was around a workforce of people who I seen getting their pay cut and cut and cut. And I can tell you the morale got lower and lower and lower. That doesn't sound as much of a surprise. I joined this party back in December of 2015. The reason that I joined this party was partly in speaking to the then candidate before the actual election, Gavin Doolan's. We had a good discussion about my passion about public sector pay, and it was after that discussion and then after taking that leap of faith and joining the party that I really believed that the SNP are the only party that could deliver on this. I'm so ecstatic to see that I can stand here now and say to those workers that I work with that thought that it would be Labour that would be the one that does this for them, it's not, it's the SNP that are going to deliver it. Please support this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Ross Cassie.
Thank you, Susan. Conference, Ross Cassie, Trade Union Group. I'm sure we all agree that the 1% pay cap being scrapped is a good idea. The workers that deliver services within our communities, many to the most vulnerable in society, even more to all of us, from local government to government and other public departments, both Scottish and UK. I suggest we send a loud and clear message to Westminster that the austerity agenda has not worked, would never work, and has only benefited the very wealthy in society. Those wealthy few have grown their wealth obscenely, and the rest of us have been left behind. To use a phrase from a recent PCS campaign, we all need a pay rise. Westminster and the Tories brought us austerity, and we must end it. Since 2010, pay for all across the public sector has fallen in real terms, and not by an insignificant amount. You heard earlier, up to 20%. This is thousands of pounds for workers. This is based upon what the cap and the freeze has done compared with the price index on inflation. No one should have to endure that level of real terms pay cut just to give the rich a tax cut. In that same period, the pensions have been attacked. The benefits have also been attacked for everyone else. Attacked, and not just attacked, but slashed. Many of our public workers are in receipts of benefits, such as tax credits. Now, tax credits are a top-up benefit for those in receipt of poor wages, i.e. paid by a bad employer. It's a disgrace in this society that 40% of those workers in DWP that administer that benefit are in receipt of those tax credits. How can this happen today? Oops, I forgot. Westminster must be a bad employer, but I didn't need to tell you that. I welcome the decision by the SNP Scottish Government to get rid of this pay cap and work with trade unions for a fair pay settlements in Scotland. We must not, however, follow Westminster's disgraceful route where that 1% pay cap ends only for the chosen few. Who decides that a police officer will get that pay rise and a nurse will not? Who decides that prison officers will get that pay rise, but the firefighters will not? Those firefighters at Grenfell, many are still suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. Do they not deserve a pay rise? And all those in local government, the people that fill the holes in the roads, those that empty our bins, they deserve a pay rise. This is the politics of divide, conquer and rule. It's an abhorrent way to govern, and all workers should and must be valued. Westminster must end the pay cap for all public sector workers within Westminster's reserved departments, many of whom live and work in Scotland. We in Scotland must remove that pay cap for all where the competence has been devolved, leading by example the way to a fairer society. But remember, any pay award that is below the rate of inflation is still a pay cut. And as such, we will be seen as keeping a cap in place. We all value those who work delivering our public services. In Scotland, we should pay a fair and decent wage. This is not rocket science. Fair pay for work will in itself reduce the benefit bill. How long must we go on mitigating the repulsive excesses of an out-of-touch Tory government?
Wind up, please, Ross.
Yep. Collect the taxes that you should and stop the avoidance and evasion by your rich buddies and pay your public sector workers. We all need a pay rise. Support this resolution.
Thank you, Conference. I have no cards in against this resolution. Can we pass it by acclaim? Before we move on, I have a public service announcement. Someone has left a red car with the registration SC56KUA in the multi-storey car park with its lights on. If anybody in here recognises that description, you might want to go and remedy that situation, but hopefully it isn't anybody here. Okay. Before we move on to Resolution 5, which will be moved by Logan Unwin, I need a formal seconder from the hall. Is there a formal seconder for Resolution 5 on cohabiting couples with dependent children? Okay, thank you very much. Logan Unwin to move Resolution 5. And Logan's a first-time speaker at conference.
Delegates, before I begin, I would like to say I think it speaks volumes about the inclusive nature of our party that a 16-year-old can propose a serious motion to be given consideration on the conference agenda. After being an activist for nearly 2 years now, I've always felt valued, and I'm honoured to speak on this motion today on behalf of my branch, Aberdeen South and North Kincardine. There is no such thing as a normal living arrangement in 2017. Family breakups are more common today than ever before, and the impact they have on children shouldn't depend on whether their parents are married or not. Currently, Section 19 of the Matrimonial Homes Family Protection Scotland Act 1981 allows spouses or civil partners who co-own a property the opportunity to refuse or postpone the division and sale of that property. This ensures a family are not forcibly made homeless. If two people choose to live together, unmarried, they are not protected by this right. This means even if there are children living in the property, the house can still be sold. What happens to the family left behind in that property? Is it right that they could be made homeless because they chose not to marry? The 2011 census showed us that there are 1.5 million families living in Scotland. 237,000 of these families were cohabiting couple families. So 16% of our families in Scotland could potentially find themselves at threat of homelessness should their relationship break down. In fact, the Office for National Statistics reported cohabiting couple families were the fastest growing family type between 1996 and 2016, more than doubling from 1.5 million families to 3.3 million families across the UK. Being made homeless can have an extremely damaging impact on a young person's life. 2 years ago, during preparation for my national qualifications, my mum, my brother, my sister and I were faced with moving into a one-bedroom flat over 15 miles away from where our lives were because we had nowhere else to go. My sense of security was removed and it had a very negative effect on my mental health. My mum suffers from multiple sclerosis, a condition which deteriorates with stress, so it was very detrimental to both her physical and mental health also. Conference, I know how damaging this can be to a person's life, and I don't want to see anyone else having to go through that. The Scottish Government has already taken lots of steps to protect people from homelessness. For example, we've abolished the right to buy to protect up to 15,500 social houses from sale. Our Housing Minister, Kevin Stewart, is working with local authorities to build record numbers of council houses, and of course we are mitigating against the damaging effects of the hated bedroom tax. Unlike the Tories, who turn their back on anyone who's struggling, the SNP has a fantastic record when it comes to protecting vulnerable people. To be honest, sometimes it feels like we spend all of our time cleaning up after the callous, short-sighted and damaging decisions of this UK government. Conference, I believe that by passing this motion today and then amending this Act to cover cohabiting couples with children, we would be providing vulnerable families, like my own, with much needed stability. Please back this motion. Thank you.
Conference, there are no cards in against that resolution. I take it as passed by acclaim. Okay. That that takes us on to Resolution 6 on respecting the devolution of powers over agriculture and fisheries, to be moved by Fergus Ewing MSP and seconded by Emma Harper MSP. And Fergus is, of course, the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy.
Thank you, Susan, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Farming, fishing and forestry are at the very heart of Scotland's rural and island communities. Scotland's farmers and crofters produce the highest quality food and they display great care for their animals and the highest standards of animal welfare. And they also tend, steward and conserve the land of Scotland. Our fishermen and onshore fish processors all around our coasts put fish onto the tables of people here and all over Europe. And the 25,000 people who work in our forestry sector make an enormous and a growing contribution, not only to the economy, but our environment too. Delegates, in the Brexit referendum, our fishermen were promised by the band of British Brexiteers total rights to the 200-mile exclusive zone, that sea of opportunity. But will the very same Tories who made these promises deliver them? Well, I tell you this, I've met both Michael Gove and his predecessor, Andrea Leadsom, and I've asked each of them, face to face, will you guarantee that you will not trade away that access, that exclusive access that you promised during the Brexit negotiations as a pawn in your Brexit negotiations? And I tell you this, I've had not a straight answer from either of them. My fear is that sellout and betrayal is precisely what they plan to do. What they plan to do this year in 2017. Just, delegates, as you will recall, they did in the 1970s when secret civil servants' documents revealed their true views as we went into the European communities, that they thought the interests of Scottish fishermen were, and I quote, expendable. The rural economy cannot function without our good friends from other EU countries who have chosen to live and work here. Farming and fishing rely on these people from all over the EU who work in so many ways in farming, fishing, and indeed forestry and fruit and tatty picking, in slaughterhouses and fish and farm processing factories. These people are welcome by us in Scotland, by us as a party, and by the vast majority of people in Scotland. They are welcome. This is their home. But so many of them have been made, delegates, to feel unwelcome in the UK. And that is as a result, directly, of what has been said by so many UK politicians, including both Mrs. May and Mr. Corbyn, weekly pandering to the message of UKIP. And already I'm hearing from around rural Scotland that many young EU citizens either have left Scotland, are leaving Scotland, or plan not to come back to Scotland because of these negative messages. What a dreadful thing to do to human beings from other countries in the European Union. Now, farming and fishing rely on markets too, the single EU market for their tariff-free export of fish, of Scotch lamb, and of many other foods, and both these sectors, and also communities and environmental schemes, receive funding of £500 million a year in total from the EU. That's £500 million a year for rural Scotland from the EU. In the EU referendum, Gove and Co promised that this sum would be, and I quote, at least matched. Will they keep these promises? Well, even now, a year and a half later after that referendum, we have neither clarity nor certainty that the UK government will fulfil the promises that were made. And on top of that, delegates, the UK government actually appropriated EU money intended solely for Scottish farmers, the so-called convergence monies. And that sum, £160 million, remains due by Westminster to Scotland's farmers. This money was entirely for our farmers because they earned least per hectare and has been taken by Whitehall. Delegates, what five-letter word means taking property that belongs to somebody else? Is it theft, I hear? But in this case, it's a very British, institutional and legalised form of theft. And delegates, of course, the Tories are making a complete hash of their Brexit plans. Another word beginning with B describes these, and I would suggest it is bourach, a very British bourach. And finally, on the power grab planned by the Tories, we must stand up against this power grab conceived by the Tories in London with the full support and connivance of the newbie Tories from, as they see it, North Britain. So, ladies and gentlemen, please pass this message today and send a message, pass this resolution today and send a message to Michael Gove and co. You're not on. Thank you.
Emma Harper MSP to second, to be followed by Jerry Fisher, who will move the direct negative.
Thank you, Susan. Conference, I'm here representing the South Scotland region, and I do declare an interest because I am the Parliamentary Liaison Officer for the Cabinet Secretary, as well as a dairyman's daughter. I'm standing up for the farmers and the producers and the rural businesses for the south of Scotland, from farm to fork. I support this motion and I urge you all to do the same. The Scottish Government needs to have a place at the table to make sure that the people of Scotland, the producers, the farmers, the crofters, to make sure their voice is heard. I can tell you from personal experience what happens when you don't have a voice at the table. I wrote to the 13 Conservative MPs, including Secretary of State David Mundell, to ask for their support to get their constituents, their farmers, their convergence uplift money. And you know what's happened? I wrote to them more than a month ago to ask for their support, and I have heard no response, not a jot, not a peep, not a single acknowledgement that they even received my letter. So I'm standing up for the south of Scotland farmers, and of course the rest of the farmers across Scotland. So let's have our voice heard. Support our farmers, support this motion. I urge you, we need to make sure our farmers' voices are heard.
Jerry Fisher to move the direct negative, and Jerry will be followed by Alan Brown MP to speak in favour of the resolution.
Jerry Fisher, Oban and Lorne. Madam Convener, I think if you refer to the National Secretary, you'll discover that I'm due 5 minutes. As the
yes, that is correct.
Contrary to what you said earlier. Conference, I rise, sadly in some respects, to denounce this motion as quite the most dishonest motion I've ever seen put to a national conference. Sadly, because Fergus moved it. His mother brought me into the party. I worked with him for 20 years. But it's still a dishonest motion. And indeed, he proved it in his moving. The words say, demands that full powers over these areas return to the Scottish Parliament. They can't return to the Scottish Parliament on the basis of the other half of the resolution, where we will have, it would seem, a seat at the negotiating table. And what that means is the negotiating table in the Council of Ministers of the EU, which is seemingly part of our party policy. The implication is that he's saying we'll have the full powers because we will no longer be in the CFP, which is in fact party policy, but membership of the EU without a derogation from the CFP, a derogation which would be vetoed by Spain at least. It's nonsense to suggest to this conference, to the Scottish people, to the Scottish fishermen particularly, who were at the heart of the growth of this party in the Northeast in the 60s and 70s and 80s, to suggest that we are going to carry out our policy of refusing to accept the CFP when he knows perfectly well that the party policy of continuing to be a member of the EU means that we accept the CFP, the common fisheries policy, and that the full powers to which this resolution refers do not mean full powers to decide that the fish are ours, that our Scottish Parliament decides what the quotas will be, which species shall be allocated to various fisheries in Scotland. It's a fact that that is not the case. It is dishonest to suggest that it is the case. I do urge this conference to vote against the acceptance of this resolution, which effectively is lying in its teeth if it goes out as a statement of this party's belief.
Alan Brown, and after that we'll move to the summing up conference. There are no other cards in against this resolution, so we'll move to the summing up, and I apologise to other speakers who have not been able to take. Thank you.
Morning conference. Apparently I'm going to speak to this on this motion, but in simple terms I think conference you should back this motion. Again, in simple terms, it's absolutely vital that Scotland gets control of these powers. And it's not just control of the powers, it's control of the budgets that go with it, particularly for agriculture. Conference, through the week I was speaking at the local Women's Fellowship church group. It's fair to say, without stereotyping, a lot of them were not SNP voters. Even then, I was speaking to them, I was speaking about going forward in terms of possible implications of Brexit, and I asked the people in the hall, did they think Westminster will continue to fund us the way we've been funded from the EU? And the answer was a resounding no. So even these people that are sometimes back to Tories at the polling booths do not believe that Westminster will continue to give us the money we rightly deserve. I'm the SNP representative in the DEFRA committee, and just recently we had the first evidence session with Michael Gove. As Fergus said, we know the Scottish fishermen were deemed expendable previously, and I put that to Michael Gove. I said, what's to say that the fishermen will not be deemed expendable again for offsets to protect the London city? He said, interestingly, he didn't deny that's what happened before, but he said, don't worry, the new Scottish Tory cohort, the 13 Tory MPs, will make sure that he's held to account. Now, it's good that you're laughing. Actually, I look back, so in the 1970s, when the prior deal was done, there were 23 Scottish Tory MPs that did not hold the Tory government to account, and yet somehow we're supposed to believe these 13 will. Now, if you look at some of these 13 Tory MPs, we've had one who didn't know how to vote in the EU referendum because it was too difficult. We're talking polar ends of arguments, but yet it was too difficult for her. We've got another Tory MP who berated SNP for not participating in a debate that was only relevant to England and Wales. Another Tory MP who represents fishing communities, and his #1 priority is to clamp down on gypsies in the travelling community. And yet these are the Tory MPs that are supposed to stand up for Scotland, and we have to believe that. And then if you look at the fact of these new Tory MPs, not one of them is deemed good enough to work with David Mundell in the Scottish office. We've got a newly appointed Lord to do that. And even David Mundell's private parliamentary secretary is an MP that represents South Leicestershire. So the reality is David Mundell does not rate the new Tory MPs, the UK Tories do not rate them, and not one of them is on the DEFRA committee. That's actually the quality of these MPs, so there's absolutely no way we can expect them to stand up for Scotland. Now, we've already heard that Westminster stole the convergence uplift money that the EU awarded, which was because Scottish farmers were receiving too low a rate. Westminster promised to review the funding by the end of 2016. Then the Farming Minister said, well, because of Brexit, they need to postpone the...
Thank you.
Right. So, anyway, back to the motion.
Sorry to cut you off in your time, Alan, but we are short of time. Jerry, do you wish to sum up for the direct negative? I'm going to give you a very strict 2 minutes.
The last speaker actually made the point for me, and I don't have to raise any new business, which I'm forbidden to do in summing up. The simple fact is that if this motion in its second half said we will continue to reject the CFP, and if that means that we're not a member of the EU, so be it, then it would be honest. It does not say so. The movers do not believe that they can get out of the CFP if they will continue to want to be a member of the EU. It's dishonest of this motion and the movers to suggest that we can get the full powers to which they refer without the removal of the common fisheries policy, which means continuing to be outside the EU. I ask, indeed reasonably demand, that this conference rejects a dishonest statement on the behalf of this party.
Thank you, Jerry. Fergus Ewing to sum up for the resolution, and then we'll move to the vote conference.
Well, thanks, Jerry. I get another shot. It was a bit short earlier on. To start off with, Jerry and I will always remain friends. And it's good that we have these disagreements, unlike the Conservatives, not through briefings from secret sources and newspapers, but out publicly in open debate. So, Jerry, you are my friend, and you're friends of all nationalists in Scotland. But having said that, I totally and fundamentally disagree with what Jerry has said. And I do so for many, many reasons. But let me just give you 3. First of all, Mike Russell has put forward our proposals, our alternative proposals for being a member of the EEA. He did so in December. I'll give you a copy, Jerry, if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. But once you do, you will see in those alternative proposals that proposal, that membership of the EEA, proposed by Mike Russell, will allow us to come out of the CFP. And I'm delighted to have an opportunity to clarify that for those fishermen listening to this debate. Secondly, this motion is about who Scotland trusts over the devolved powers that we have had since 1999 in the Scottish Parliament over agriculture, fishing and forestry. All of us know that these were powers that Scotland has and should continue to have. And the question, fellow delegates, fellow nationalists, is who should possess these powers? The people of Scotland through the democratic representatives, or the Tory government in London, as Alan Brown has quite categorically described. They just cannot be trusted to care. And lastly, fellow delegates, Jerry mentioned that my mother recruited you. I think that was a good thing. But you remember what she said nearly 50 years ago about Scotland when she lit the light that since then has not gone out in Scotland, that Stop the World. Scotland wants to get on. And delegates, once we have...
Thank you, Fergus.
Once we have rejoined that world as an independent country, of course, it is up to us to choose our membership of organisations, our subscription to international laws, and to respect the fundamental rights of every human being, especially my friend, Jerry Fisher.
Thank you. Conference will move to the vote. If you could have your cards ready. It's a straightforward vote for and against the resolution. So can I see cards against the resolution first of all? And cards in favour of the resolution? The resolution is passed overwhelmingly. Okay, that takes us on to resolution number 7 on drug reform. We have a lot of cards in for this one, Conference. It's unlikely I'm going to be able to take everyone, so I will ask all speakers to keep very strictly to time and keep an eye on the lights on the podium, which will tell you how much time you've got left. So can I have Josh Menny, first of all, to move resolution 7, to be followed by Ronnie Cowan, MP, to second.
Conference, hello. Since I joined the SNP 3 years ago, I've been involved in a number of campaigns, from promoting inclusive education for our children to making work pay for workers in the social care sector. Such huge initiatives that have the potential to transform our society and, most importantly, transform people's lives. But I'm here to talk to you about another issue which I believe needs our immediate attention, with a view to reform current policy on this matter. Most people have a black or white view on this subject, but it's important we take a wider view on this because it's something that will affect many people in every walk of life. The subject we are here to talk about today is drug reform. I believe that championing drug reform is crucial for a progressive party such as the SNP, and I'm here today to push home that point as to why we need to take seriously as the largest political party in Scotland. For decades, successive UK governments have made a concerted effort to continue the war on drugs at huge expense to our legal system, the everyday taxpayer, and our society. This is just a needless war, an outdated war, and failed war we need to wash our hands of and move on from. When it comes to drug policy, I've made my personal opinion clear. I've written articles, I've spoken to journalists, I've written and spoken to government ministers and raised the issue at branch meetings. I've advocated that we take a progressive and common sense approach and move to legalise and regulate drugs such as cannabis. But this is because of what is going on under our current system, where there were 867 drug-related deaths in 2016 in Scotland alone. I know there are people in this hall that may have a sibling, a parent, a nephew or niece, cousin, uncle or aunt, or perhaps even a child, who they know are entering into dangerous environments, such as a drug dealer's den. And they'll be buying substances of which they have no certainty or clue as to how strong that product is, this is in comparison to what we could have, a system in which the government could carefully regulate the production and supply of low-potency substances. But this motion isn't just about that. I understand that there will be some in this hall that have been sceptical, even in knowing this. I recognise that the topic isn't so black and white, and that's why in this motion today, I have called for us to take a comprehensive review of our current drug policy, and in the amendment which I helped pen will ensure we fully consider the benefits that legalisation and regulation will bring. If we vote today to pass both the motion and the amendment, it will allow our party and the Scottish Government to further gather evidence for our party leadership to have the confidence to take this policy further. Even before the review has begun, and even before we have voted on this motion, we all surely know things can no longer continue as they have. There must be change, and we must begin to champion this change. As Scotland's largest political party, we have to understand and accept that drugs are always going to exist. We're going to have to make a choice and determine who would we rather see control the production and supply of drugs, government or organised crime groups. Conference, there is no third option and there's no alternative. Every decade, every year, every month and every day we allow the war on drugs to continue, it's more money, more lives, more time and resources being misused. There's a well-known organisation in the UK with a collective of members who have first-hand experience as to the impact the war on drugs has had. An organisation called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, whose members include retired police inspector and chair of Strathclyde Police Federation, James Duffy, a former MI5 member, Annie Machin, and so many more members of law enforcement that have served our country. When we have organisations such as Law Enforcement Against Prohibition and experts on the field such as Professor David Nutt actively campaigning for an overhaul of drugs policy, then Conference, perhaps it's time we start to listen. Please vote in favour of the motion and support the amendment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. Ronnie Cowan MP to be followed by Jennifer Dunn, who will move the amendment.
Good morning, Conference. Traditionally, we've labelled people with drug addiction problems as junkies, crackheads and stoners. We all knew these people wanted to steal our TVs to supply the money for their next fix. The view was that these people were itinerant criminals living a lifestyle of their choice, and that drug abuse was just part of that. Hopefully, Conference, hopefully, that's an outdated point of view. More and more experts from the areas of drug addiction and crime prevention are coming to the same conclusion. This is a health issue, not a criminal one. Given some of the media coverage, it would be easy to believe that we have been in a fight against drugs since time began, and that some sort of underclass living off of benefits and squandering them on drugs should be locked up to protect us from them. But the truth is somewhat different. We, or rather a few individuals representing our society, decided that we need to ban these drugs, those substances, and criminalise the users. And so the war on drugs and war on drug users began. The Misuse of Drugs Act was signed in 1971. There were 1,300 problematic drug users or addicts. After 46 years of coming down hard on users and jailing people for possession, that number has risen to 380,000. The war continues. There are more addicts, more cost, more pain, and no signs that things will ever improve. When we started the war on drugs, we moulded people's perception and created the intolerant attitude that we have today. When we made a range of drugs illegal, we handed over the production and distribution of them to the criminal fraternity, and we ostracised and stigmatised drug users. And yet we still managed to get it right sometimes. When it was identified that HIV was spreading because injecting drug users were sharing needles, the city of Glasgow was one of the first to hand out clean needles, and as a result, fewer than 2% of Glasgow's injectors became HIV positive. In New York, where they didn't hand out needles, the HIV positive rate amongst injection users was 50%. When we treat drug abuse as a health issue, we improve the situation. In Portugal, within 10 years of the implementation of health-based policies, the number of drug addicts has halved. While we continue to persecute and punish, we create despair and disharmony. People are criminalised and lives are destroyed. The alternative, which would mean a monumental change in attitude as much as anything, can heal and rebuild. The cost of law enforcement would reduce. The money saved could be invested in healthcare and harm reduction. Ladies and gentlemen, please, the Conference, let's start the healing process now. Thank you.
Jennifer Dunn to move the amendment, to be followed by Christina Cannon to second.
Thanks, Susan. Conference, this amendment came about because the proposers of the resolution wanted to go further than the version that appeared on the final agenda, so I was working with Josh to produce the amendment. Conference, we want Scotland to be a modern, independent nation with power over immigration, defence and every other policy area a country might expect to control. Sometimes the answers to what we do with these powers are obvious, at least within the SNP. But we should never shy away from pointing out that we're capable of making hard decisions over more contentious policy areas. And indeed, an independent Scotland would have to do this on drugs. What this amendment commits us to doing is for calling for powers over drugs policy, and once we have them transferred to the Scottish Parliament, promises that we will review them. It might be that after such a review, we end up sticking with what we have, but there are literally a world of other options out there. From regulating soft drugs to changing how we manage people with long-term addictions. There are also options on how we manage recreational drugs use at festivals and clubs and many other aspects of drugs policy. The resolution and amendment don't commit us to any changes, but they do commit us to asking for the powers to have a thorough and pragmatic review of drugs policy. Thousands of people in Scotland are affected by drugs, whether users, whether people who have family members who use drugs, or people who live in communities with high levels of drug use and abuse. We owe it to all these people to have the best and least harmful approach to drugs that we possibly can. Please support the resolution and the amendment.
Councillor Christina Cannon to second the amendment, to be followed by Daniel Forbes to move the remit back.
Thank you, Susan. I'd first like to start by congratulating Josh Meney for all the hard work he's done surrounding drug reform, which has allowed us to debate such an important issue here today. Conference, it is in my view no doubt that current drug policy is failing. Criminalising drug users creates a stigma which isolates people from the society they are in, communities they live, and often the families they are part of. It creates a culture that ignores the possibility of exploring substance misuse as a health issue rather than a crime. Conference, this is not an easy culture to change, but speaking about it here today is an excellent start. It requires a forward-looking attitude and commitment from everyone involved so that the SNP is leading the way on such an ambitious and progressive policy. But I must emphasise how crucial the amendment is to this debate. It is essential that the powers relating to drugs policy are transferred to the Scottish Parliament so we can ensure that this motion reaches its full potential and establish future approaches as to how this would best work in Scotland. It is of course my opinion that the Parliament that knows and represents Scottish people the most is the one that is based in Scotland. And so with the devolution of powers that allow our Scottish Government to legislate in the best interest of the Scottish people, we should take no chance with leaving drug policy behind. Having these powers would allow the Scottish Parliament to undertake the most extensive drug review in order to tackle the war on drugs. We will be working with organisations such as Law Enforcement Against Prohibition to pave the way for a system that works for everyone, particularly drug users who have been failed by a stigmatising and alienating culture created under current legislation. We will be able to look for new solutions to help those who suffer from substance misuse, but at the same time protect human rights, build respect, make communities safer and change attitudes. Delegates, I understand that tackling the war on drugs may seem challenging, but this motion, with the amendment included, sets out an ambitious and progressive pathway that this party can lead on. Please support the amendment.
Daniel Forbes to move the remit back. Daniel will be followed by Aileen Campbell, MSP, who will speak in favour of the resolution. And Daniel's a first-time speaker at conference, colleagues.
Thank you, Conference. Can I just start off by thanking Josh for bringing this motion to us today. The resolution and the amendment that has been brought before you today raises what some people and families may believe to be a rather contentious subject. While I agree that a comprehensive review of the current drugs policy is overdue, what the resolution does not consider is that there would have to be a change, not just in the UK law, but there would also have to be removal of UN treaties, up to 3 of them, of which we are signed up to. We would need to remove these treaties, which include the illegal trafficking of drugs and psychotropic substances. We currently do not have the levers available for this. Additionally, the resolution and amendment have been written as though we have limitless amounts of data and research into all of these substances, which simply is not the case. Not all of the effects of drugs use, both short and long term, are known, and if we were to believe that they were, then I believe that to be a very naive statement. It only needs for one person to take a substance once for there to be an irreversible reaction that could have fatal consequences. I wholeheartedly support the need to tackle the stigma around drug addiction, but we also have to accept that there are families that have been permanently affected by the tragic effects that comes through the use of these substances, who will want stronger measures in place and not allow any relaxation of legislation. We, as a socially responsible party, have to ensure that there is a balance that protects all citizens in Scotland, not to alienate any. Recent data released in August shows that there was 867 drug-related deaths in Scotland, 2.5 times the rate of the rest of the UK and potentially the highest in the European Union. We must remember that these were 867 people, 867 families that have been permanently broken by drugs in the last year. There's a lot more work that would require to be done before we could look at the legality of the general sale of drugs, and it is very easy to look at other countries and states to see what they have done, but the Scottish Government has a duty of care to all of its citizens. We have a responsibility to ensure that the decisions we make in this hall are for the benefit for the whole population of Scotland. Please support the remit back to allow the full exploration of how a well-researched approach in conjunction with stakeholders could be achieved that is progressive, inclusive, evidenced, and overall not controversial. Please support the remit back.
Conference, I should have asked for a formal seconder for the remit back. Is there a formal seconder in the room? Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Going to move on to Aileen Campbell, MSP, Minister for Public Health, to be followed by Lachie McNeill. Conference, could we agree to suspend standing orders to extend this session slightly so that we can move to the summing up? Is that agreeable to conference? Thank you very much. Aileen.
Thank you. Conference, next year marks the 10th anniversary of Scotland's drug strategy, Road to Recovery, and it has achieved a great deal. Drug taking in the general population is falling, the level of drug taking amongst our young people remains low, and we have greatly reduced waiting times for drug-related treatment. But we cannot be complacent and must recognise the changing landscape of drug taking in Scotland. And we must, Conference, recognise the fact that last year 867 people died a drug-related death. Conference, in politics, we often trade blows in facts and figures, but we should never forget that that figure represents 867 families bereaved, a loved one gone, a loss of potential, and lives devastated. It's a figure that weighs heavily on me, and it means we simply cannot continue as we have. And that's why in July I announced that we would refresh our approach to substance misuse. It's an approach that will be firmly rooted to looking at addiction through a public health lens. Conference, people with addictions are just that. They're people, vulnerable people who need care and support. And we all need to understand that addiction can and could impact each and every one of us, as the movers of the motion indicated. And I'm determined that our approach won't stop at only looking at addiction through a public health lens, but will also be compassionate, person-centred, supportive, empathetic and loving. It will help those in recovery and celebrate the achievements of our flourishing recovery communities, helping our effort to lift the stigma that is all too associated with addiction. It will also recognise that for many, recovery isn't yet an option, and so requires a focus on harm reduction and an understanding that the journey many will have will be bumpy along the way. Our approach is encapsulated by our shift to seek, keep and treat, a recognition that the best way to prevent drug deaths is to actively seek out this hard-to-reach group, keep them in services and treat them appropriately, and is backed by an additional £20 million worth of funding announced by the First Minister in her programme for government. Conference, in asking you to support this motion, please know that this government is already putting the necessary changes in place to change our response to addiction. It aims to be trauma-informed, compassionate, and be reflective of the progressive society that I all know we want to create. But I would also urge you to all read the analysis by NHS Health Scotland and the University of Glasgow that look to understand Scotland's drug deaths. This largely ageing cohort have a number of health problems because of decades of drug use. NHS Scotland suggests that this cohort is partly down to economic and social policy decisions of the 1980s, which created rising income inequalities along with the erosion of hope amongst those that are least resilient. Conference austerity politics of over 30 years ago are impacting on us now in the most tragic way and should serve as a stark reminder to those peddling austerity now the problems they will be potentially storing up if they continue to take hope away from a generation. So please support the motion.
Thank you. Lachie McNeill, who will speak in favour of the amendment, and then if the movers could be ready for the summing up.
Conference, none of us know what shape a radically reformed approach to addressing the problems caused by drug addiction will take. But one thing is absolutely clear, that whatever shape that radically altered approach takes, implementing it will require the capacity to amend legislation in areas where we do not presently have control. So I wanted to speak in favour of the amendment here because the mover and seconder of the amendment are absolutely right. This amendment is an absolutely crucial part of what is being proposed here. You need to pass them both together to make it work, or to enable a totally different approach to be implemented in law. I also wanted to make a general point here because there's a wider context to this. I keep reading in newspaper commentaries these days about how this party's in a kind of limbo state, not quite knowing what to do until it waits to see how Brexit negotiations develop and so forth. There is one thing that never changes. Every day in life, this party can be identifying radical changes which are needed to make Scotland a better country. And where these radical changes need further transfer of powers to the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, this party can daily be making the case for that transfer of powers. That is what we have always done. That is what we should never stop doing. That is what we should be doing every day in life, irrespective of circumstances that emerge in the wider picture. That never changes, that never stops, and ultimately, that is the road to independence. Support the amendment.
Thank you. We'll move to the summing up conference. Jen Dunn, do you wish to sum up for the amendment? 2 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair. There was just a few points that I wanted to respond to. Firstly, this resolution in itself doesn't commit to anything that would break international treaties. In fact, I would expect sort of international drugs law and how we would comply with it to be part of any review. It's also worth pointing out that many other countries have more liberal drugs laws already. Families are affected every day by the current drugs policies. Families with members in prison, families with members missing, disappeared or dead, families with ill members, or even people who live next to drug addicts or in the same close. When I was a counsellor in the East End, I dealt with some horrendous cases with families with small children who resided close to drug addicts. And, you know, we need to think about everyone here. What we're proposing is relatively cautious and would include a review of evidence and very possibly include commissioning more research. But ultimately, and I think Lahi's speech was excellent, if we're going for independence and we want all the powers a modern nation should have, then we are going to have to consider drugs policy, and it would be better to do that as part of a comprehensive review than on a piecemeal basis. So please support the resolution and support the amendment.
Thank you. Daniel, do you wish to sum up for the remit back? You also have 2 minutes. Maximum, you can take less.
Thank you, Chair. In the briefest of forms, part of this remit back is to look at the legality around our scientific research. When we actually review our drugs policy, at the moment, our data is all coming from material that has been created in the labs. It's not actually been the raw substance that people can get on the streets. What we need to do is have a more stepped approach. Have a look at how can we allow our scientific researchers to actually go and get and legally acquire this substance so that they can actually see what exactly happens. How can they affect the human body and mind? We need to be able to go and say, this is definitively what's available on the streets. This is what people can actually get. If we're having a full review, as is stated, we're going on data that's been, it's been created in labs, it's not available on the streets. So what I'd ask is for us to put the remit back so that we can go and fully understand what it is that's been challenged, and then therefore we can be a more knowledgeable delegate and know exactly what's being passed. Please support the remit back.
And Josh, finally, to sum up for the resolution.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you, conference, and it's so great to actually finally debate a topic like this at conference. Well, we've all mentioned that the 867 people and families have been bereaved under current drug policy in 2016 alone. That's why it's so important we call for change, and that's not taken into account for the thousands of people and families who continue to struggle with the negative impact of the war on drugs today. Conference, we are all in agreement current drug policy is not working. This year's conference tagline is progress, and we've got it written right here. Well, let's make progress. Progress in current drug policy, progress in halting the criminalisation of vulnerable users and victims, and progress on the failing war on drugs. Conference, please back the motion and support the amendment. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all speakers. We'll move to the vote now, conference. First of all, on the amendment. Can I see cards in favour of the amendment? And cards against? The amendment is overwhelmingly carried. Now on to the remit back. Can I see cards in favour of the remit back? And cards against? The remit back falls. And finally, on the amended resolution, can I see cards in favour? And cards against? The resolution's overwhelmingly carried. Thanks very much, conference. Enjoy your lunch.